Where did that come from? Matthias Stael's voice dropped an entire register when she stepped out of the elevator. And why am I only seeing it now? He didn't finish the question. He just stood there in the entryway of his Cole Harbour penthouse with a glass of scotch suspended halfway to his lips, his dark eyes locked on Sabine Orell like she'd materialized out of a wall. Sabine had been working for Matthias for 3 years. In that time he had looked through her, past her, around her, and occasionally at a point approximately 6 inches above her left ear. He had never once looked at her like this. "I'm sorry if I'm late, Mr. Stael," she said, keeping her voice even. "The cab on Davy took longer than—" "You're not late." His voice came out graveled and low, nowhere near his usual boardroom register. "You're exactly on time. That's not what I asked." The dress was a mistake. She'd known it the moment the woman at the consignment shop on Main Street had held it against her. A deep garnet silk, vintage cut, bias draping from a low cowl neck to a hem that just grazed her ankles. Nothing scandalous about it. Long sleeves, fully covered. And yet the silk fell in a way that made it very clear Sabine Orell had been hiding something for 3 years under the oversized cardigans and high-waisted trousers she wore to the office every single day. She'd bought it because it was the only formal option under $400 that didn't have a cutout above the hip. She hadn't bought it to make a point. But standing in the marble entryway of Matthias Stael's penthouse at 7:45 on a Thursday evening, watching the most controlled man she'd ever met forget to take a sip of his drink, Sabine was no longer certain about her own intentions. It was $40 at a consignment shop, she said, which was the truth and also the most useless thing she could have offered in that moment. Matthias set his glass down on the entryway console, slowly, with the kind of deliberate care people used when they were doing something to keep their hands occupied. He crossed the room toward her, and Sabine had a sudden vivid understanding of what it meant to be the only still thing in the path of something moving with intent. He stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne, cedar and wood smoke, and something colder underneath, like lake water in October. 3 years, he said. 3 years, she agreed, not knowing why. You've worked for me for 3 years, Sabine, and you came to the office every day in those. He stopped himself. A muscle in his jaw worked. You own a dress like this. I own several dresses, Mr. Stael. You've just never had occasion to see them. His eyes moved over her face with an unhurried focus that made her want to take a step backward. She didn't. We're leaving in 10 minutes, he said finally, stepping back. Don't let anyone in that room stand too close to you. She didn't ask what he meant. She would understand before the night was over. Sabine had not planned to work for Matthias Stael. She had planned to finish her PhD in music theory at UBC, write her dissertation on harmonic structures in post-war Canadian composition, and spend the rest of her 20s in a tiny office surrounded by scores and cold coffee. Then Seth had happened. Seth Orell was her younger brother by 4 years, and he had always been, as their mother put it with exhausted affection, a lot of enthusiasm and not enough patience. He dropped out of Simon Fraser in his 2nd year to pursue what he called investment opportunities, which turned out to mean high-risk private equity deals with people whose offices weren't exactly listed on Google Maps. One of those people was Camille Rousseau. Camille Rousseau ran Rousseau Pacific, a Vancouver-based maritime logistics firm that competed directly with Stael Maritime Group for contracts along the Pacific Trade Corridor from Prince Rupert down to Seattle. She was polished, precise, and exactly as ruthless as the shipping industry demanded. She was also, beneath the measured smile and the Fairmont board meeting aesthetic, connected to enough grey market freight handling to make her someone Seth absolutely should not have been doing business with. He owed her $320,000. When Camille came to Sabine's Kitsilano apartment 18 months after Seth's deal collapsed, she came alone, and she was very calm about it. Your brother has made a poor decision and an impossible debt, she'd said, sitting at Sabine's kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, and a tablet displaying Seth's signature on 6 different contracts. "I'm not interested in his money. I'm interested in Matthias Stael's." The offer was clean in the way that threats always are when dressed in clean clothes. Sabine would apply for a position at Stael Maritime Group. She would document Stael's Pacific routing schedules, cargo manifests, and client relationship data. She would pass the information to Camille, and Seth's debt would be dissolved quietly and completely. "And if I don't?" Sabine had asked. "Then Seth's name goes on a list of unreliable parties that circulates amongst every private investor network between Vancouver and Hong Kong. He will never work in finance again, and I will make certain that some of the more colorful aspects of his business dealings reach the appropriate regulatory bodies." Sabine had taken the job. She had never passed a single real document to Camille Rousseau. For 2 years, 2 years of building a life inside Stael Maritime Group, of learning every corridor and every system and every tightly controlled face in that glass tower on Burrard Street, she had fed Camille fabricated data, altered manifests, fake routing schedules with plausible-sounding vessel names and container numbers that didn't exist. She had bought Seth's debt in weekly installments of invented intelligence, stalling Camille with the patience of a woman who had spent 6 years in academic research and understood intimately how to make nothing look like something. She had done it because Seth was her brother, and she loved him, and she was terrified. She had kept doing it long after the fear faded to a background hum because of Matthias. Matthias Stael was not a good man in the conventional sense. He was disciplined and cold, and he operated with a precision that left no room for softness. He worked 16-hour days and expected everyone around him to understand, without being told, exactly what he needed and when he needed it. He remembered every number, every contract, every name in every meeting. He had no patience for inefficiency and no interest in being liked. Sabine had been efficient. She had not tried to be liked. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of working alongside him, scheduling his mornings, managing his correspondence, sitting across the boardroom table at 11 p.m. when a cargo dispute needed resolving before the Vancouver Port Authority opened, she had made the catastrophic error of understanding him. Not his business, him, the way he stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 38th floor when a deal fell through, very still and very quiet, working it out in silence before turning back to his desk. The coffee she put on his desk at 7 a.m., that he never asked for and never acknowledged and always drank completely. The fact that when he gave instructions, no matter how curtly, he always made certain to include the background information Sabine would need to carry them out. Because he'd noticed, though he'd never said so, that she worked better when she understood why. She had fallen in love with him the way you fall into a well, without a warning, without a flaw. She had buried it under professionalism and practical distance, and the sensible braid she put her hair in every morning, and she had protected him from Camille Rousseau's information network for 3 years, whilst wearing oversized cardigans and flat shoes, and she had been entirely prepared to keep doing it indefinitely. And then he'd looked at her in the entryway of his Cole Harbour penthouse, like she was something he'd just discovered existed, and every sensible calculation she'd made began to quietly collapse. The Vancouver Symphony benefit was held at the Fairmont Pacific Rim, and it was exactly the kind of room Sabine had been trained by 3 years of Matthias Stael's schedule to read instantly. 42 tables, 12 board-level corporate donors, 2 provincial cabinet ministers, 3 judges who shouldn't have been in the same room as 4 of the other guests. Champagne towers. A string quartet playing Debussy in the corner, with the weary grace of professionals who had long ago made their peace with background music. Matthias's hand found the small of her back the moment they stepped off the elevator from the underground garage, not possessively, not at first. More like instinct, the same way he'd redirect a conversation or adjust a seating arrangement, a quiet repositioning of the room. But when the first man turned to look at her, a real look the kind that lingered, Matthias shifted. Not dramatically. He simply moved so that he was slightly between her and the room, his hand pressing more firmly against her back. "You don't have to do that," she murmured. "I'm not doing anything," he said flatly, which was not true at all. The first hour went smoothly. Sabine had reviewed the donor list that afternoon. She knew who was in the room, knew the relevant histories, and fed Matthias the appropriate context in low murmurs as they moved through the crowd, the same way she'd been doing at every event for 3 years. Except that tonight people kept looking at her, and Matthias kept watching the people who looked at her. "You're distracted," she noted, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "I'm not distracted," he said, which was also not true. They were standing near the east windows when the voice came. Matthias, smooth, precise, a little too warm in the way of people who've rehearsed warmth. "You've brought a guest. How unexpected." Camille Rousseau looked exactly as she always looked in photographs. Ash blonde and immaculate in a cream column gown, her hair swept up, her expression pleasantly neutral in the way of someone who had never needed to look hurried. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, not champagne, and her eyes moved to Sabine in the way of someone who had been expecting this precise moment for some time. Sabine's stomach dropped so cleanly and completely that for 1 second she couldn't feel the floor beneath her heels. "Camille," Matthias said. The temperature of his voice fell several degrees without rising in volume. "I didn't realize Rousseau Pacific had bought a table this year." "We co-sponsored the string section," Camille said, with a modest tilt of her head. Then she looked directly at Sabine. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Camille Rousseau." "My assistant," Matthias said in the tone he used for ending conversations. "Yes," Camille agreed pleasantly. "Sabine Orell. Music theory PhD candidate, wasn't it? Before she came to Stael Maritime, she took a small sip of her water. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. Her brother, Seth." The room didn't go quiet. The room continued exactly as it had been. Strings, crystal, low conversation, the scent of expensive candles. It only felt quiet because Sabine's entire circulatory system seemed to have paused. Matthias turned to look at her, not with suspicion, not yet, just the very beginning of a question forming in the dark of his eyes. "He's been quite industrious on my behalf," Camille continued, her voice pleasant and precise and absolutely merciless. "Though I have to say, the intelligence he promised me from your office, Matthias, has been disappointingly thin. Nearly 3 years of manifests that upon closer inspection don't correspond to any actual vessel registered with Transport Canada." She looked at Sabine with something that might have been on another face, a measure of reluctant respect. "You're quite skilled at fabrication, Miss Orell, I'll give you that." "Sabine." Matthias's voice was very quiet, very still, the way a frozen lake is still. "Let me explain," she said. "Not here." He stepped back from Camille with an unhurried, lethal composure that communicated everything without requiring volume. He looked at Camille once, and whatever passed in that look made Camille raise her glass in a small, acknowledging toast. Then he took Sabine's arm and walked her toward the corridor. The Fairmont's private event suite on the 2nd level was empty and unlocked. Matthias closed the door. The room smelled like fresh linen and floor wax, and the faint ghost of whoever had last used it. Sabine stood with her back toward the window that looked out onto the dark shimmer of Burrard Inlet, and Matthias stood with his arms crossed, and the silence between them was the most frightening thing she had experienced in 3 years. "Talk," he said. So she did. She told him everything. The visit to her Kitsilano apartment, the contract Seth had signed, the ultimatum, the job application, the 2 years of fabricated data, the altered manifests, the careful inventory of things she had never shown Camille, and the careful inventory of fictional things she had. She told him it all without softening it, without editorializing, the way you describe a complicated score. Start at the beginning, keep the tempo even, let the structure speak. Then she told him why she'd protected him. It cost her something to say it, something she hadn't known she was still holding until it was gone. I couldn't give her anything real about you, she said, her voice steady even though her hands were not. Not because I was certain she wouldn't find out, but because I've spent 3 years in your office and I know how you work, and I couldn't be the person responsible for someone using that against you. That's not the whole answer, he said. She looked at him. The suite was dim, lit only by the ambient glow from the harbor outside, and Matthias Stael was watching her with an expression she had never once seen on him in 3 years of working 4 feet from his office door. Not cold, not calculating, but genuinely uncertain, as though he was standing at the edge of a calculation he hadn't yet completed. No, she admitted, it isn't. She told him the rest. She said it plainly, the way her mother had always told her to say frightening things, directly and then wait. She watched his face when she said it. That particular moment, when you put down the thing you've been carrying so long it's become part of your skeleton, and you don't know whether the person in front of you will pick it up carefully or let it fall. Matthias uncrossed his arms. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the careful, controlled way he did everything else. It was immediate and complete, and it tasted like scotch and 3 years of something she hadn't known he was carrying either. When he stepped back, they were both breathing with effort. "We're leaving," he said, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Now." She picked up the garnet silk at the hem, and she followed him out. The Stael Maritime offices on Burrard were empty at 10:30 on a Thursday. The cleaning crews had long gone. The city lights came through the floor-to-ceiling glass in long, bright strips across the polished concrete floors. Matthias sat at his desk with his jacket off and his phone in his hand, speaking in terse, quiet exchanges that told her his security director was already in motion. Sabine stood at the window overlooking the inlet, the same window she'd seen him stand at 100 times, and she waited. "Seth's in Gastown," Matthias said, ending the call. "My team has eyes on him." "He's not in danger," she said. "He won't be at Camille's offices. Seth doesn't work like that. He moves around." "You sound like you know his patterns." "He's my brother," she paused. "I thought I did." The door opened 20 minutes later. 2 of Matthias's security staff came in first, and then Seth was between them. Not restrained, not visibly frightened. He was wearing a blazer over a flannel shirt, which was Seth's version of business casual. And he looked at Sabine with an expression that shifted quickly from surprise into something harder and more calculating than any younger brother's face had a right to be. He did not look like someone who had been living in fear. "Sabine," he said, "so you actually told him?" She hadn't expected him to already be past tense about it. She hadn't expected the way his eyes moved to Matthias immediately. Not with guilt, not with shame, but with the rapid assessment of a man determining what leverage remained. "Seth," she said carefully. "Camille told him tonight about the arrangement." Seth was quiet for a beat. Then, "So she burned me," he exhaled, almost amused. "I told her you'd never deliver anything real." She kept insisting. He looked at Sabine with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite admiration. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." The floor shifted slightly beneath Sabine's feet. "What arrangement?" she said. Her voice came out very quiet. Seth ran a hand through his hair, their mother's hair, thick and reddish-brown, and he'd always known how to use the boyishness of it. He was doing it now. "Camille needed an inside contact at Stael," he said. "I knew you were looking for work. The PhD wasn't going anywhere, and Stael Maritime was hiring for an executive assistant, which with your organizational skills—" He stopped. The calculation in his face faltered, just briefly, as he saw her expression. "Look, I didn't invent a debt. I had a real shortfall with her network, and I needed to resolve it. I introduced the idea, and she ran with it. You were the logical—" "You sold me," Sabine said. The room was very quiet. Seth's expression was still trying to work, still looking for the angle. "I solved a problem we both had," he said. "You needed a job. I needed—" "You called me at 2 in the morning." Her voice was steady in a way she hadn't previously known herself capable of. You were crying. You said you were afraid. You said you had nowhere to turn. I took a job deceiving a man I respect, and I spent 2 years lying to protect you. And you were—" She stopped, breathed. "You were a partner. You were on her payroll from the beginning." Seth looked at her. He did not deny it. Matthias had not moved or spoken since Seth came in. He spoke now in the same quiet tone he used when he'd already run every calculation and was simply waiting for the instruction to act. "Say the words, Sabine. Whatever you want done." She looked at Seth. She looked at the man who had called her from a payphone in the rain and wept convincingly enough that she had taken apart her own life and rebuilt it around protecting him. She looked at him standing in Matthias Stael's offices at 11 o'clock at night, still searching for the angle, still running his particular arithmetic. He was not worth Matthias' resources. He was not even worth her anger, really. Anger required caring what someone did next. "Don't touch him," she said. Seth let out a long, audible breath. "Walk him out," she continued, looking at Matthias's security staff. But first, she turned to Matthias. "Whatever contracts he has with Rousseau Pacific, your legal team can make those very uncomfortable for Camille to honor." A slow, dark understanding moved through Matthias's eyes. "They can make them impossible to honor without significant regulatory scrutiny. Do that." She turned back to Seth. "You'll lose the income, and when Camille comes under scrutiny, your name will be in the documents she cooperated on, which means your network will know you're a liability. You won't get another position in this industry in Vancouver." She held his gaze for one long moment. "Go somewhere else. Start over honestly if you know how, but don't call me." Seth stared at her. For the first time, the calculation in his face was gone entirely, replaced by something rawer and far less comfortable. "I'm still your—" "Walk him out," she said. And they did. The offices were quiet again. Sabine stood at the window and looked at the city, and the black water below, and the pale smear of light where the North Shore rose across the inlet. She had lived in Vancouver for 6 years. She had never quite noticed until now that from this window, on a clear night, you could see all the way to the mountains. Matthias came to stand beside her, not close, but close enough. "You didn't want him destroyed," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Destroying him is too easy," she said. "Letting him live in the consequences of who he is, that takes longer. That's the part that costs him. That's a particular kind of cold. I learned it from watching you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, something she'd never seen on that face in 3 years, and immediately wanted to see again. "I didn't know you were watching." "I've been watching for 3 years," she said. "I imagine you noticed, eventually." He turned to face her, and in the reflected light from the city outside, she could see the expression on his face clearly, for the first time all evening. Not the controlled boardroom mask, not the cold authority, not the careful distance he maintained between himself and everything else. Something quieter, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, remarkably like relief. "You're not my assistant anymore," he said. "No, I'm not." "What you are," he said slowly, as though working out the language for something he hadn't had to name before, "is the only person in this city who has actively protected my interests without being compensated to care about them." He looked at her. "I'd like to know what to do with that." "You could start," she said, "by not calling me Miss Orell." He reached out and with one careful hand turned her face toward him. Outside, the city carried on exactly as it had been. The harbor lights doubled on the water. Somewhere across the inlet, a BC ferry's crossing was making its slow way between shores, lit up white and steady against the dark. She had spent 3 years making herself invisible in his world. She had worn the wrong clothes and said the right things, and kept herself at precisely the distance required to keep him safe from someone who wanted to use her against him. She had not expected that the night she finally stopped disappearing, the world would simply rearrange itself around her. But Matthias Stael was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a room full of moving things, and for the first time in 3 years, Sabine Orell did not look away. The betrayal didn't break her. It only confirmed what she had already spent 3 years quietly learning. That family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the person who stands between you and the room and says, without needing to explain it, that you belong here. If this story hit you somewhere real, hit like and drop a comment below. Would you have given Seth one last chance or handed him over to Matthias entirely? Subscribe to Cruel Boss Stories for more, and we'll see you in the next one.